presentation, we'll be looking at an extension of the SIR model to include the latent compartments. And as I previously mentioned, this content is adapted from a previous training. And by the end of this presentation, we hope to understand the limitations of the SIR model and understand how we can extend this to account for complexities in disease transmission process. So my first question is, what are some of the limitations of the SIR model we studied? Sorry? John, I'll call you because your question is kind of similar to this.
Okay, I'll give it a try. I would say that since this model has three major compartments, that is the susceptible, infected, and the recovered. I think maybe the first part of my question will fall here, that it does not fully capture it doesn't fully capture the entire population. For example, if I want to work with asymptomatics that are not clinically presenting of the disease characteristics, so I'm not so sure, but I will not call them infectious because they have low parasitemia, for example, of the parasite, but then I don't know, but I think it doesn't capture fully the entire population.
Okay, yes. So I would say that for the SIR model, it assumes that you become immediately infectious when you get exposed to an infectious person. So if I meet someone with COVID today, this model assumes that immediately I come into contact with the person, then I become infected and infectious with COVID-19 as well, which is not realistic. Any other limitations?
Sylvia, this is Abel. Yeah, I think it also assumes that once somebody is susceptible, is infected, and has recovered, that is it. But for the COVID scenario, we found that even somebody who had recovered could still be susceptible to getting the disease back.
Exactly, yeah. So then for the SIR model, we are assuming that there is long-term immunity. So once you recover from the disease, you never get it again. But is there an example of a disease that comes to mind where once you get it once, you never get it again?
I think measles, when you get measles and maybe you get vaccinated, you may not get it again.
Okay. Any other example?
Yes, I think chickenpox.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So the main limitation we are looking at for this presentation is the fact that the SIR model assumes infectiousness, immediate infectiousness upon infection, and it doesn't allow us to capture the latent period in the transmission dynamics. So the latent period, it's the period between when you get exposed to a disease and then when you start getting infectious, that is when you start being able to transmit the disease to other people. So what would be the implication of not including a latent period for a disease like tuberculosis? What do we know about tuberculosis that would require us to incorporate latent period when trying to model TB transmission? anyone working with tuberculosis or have an understanding of the epidemiology of tuberculosis on here? Who hasn't spoken yet? Nixon, Ayena.
No, I do not have an idea.
Okay. Mohammed.
Yes.
Why would
I think, yes. Can you repeat the question, please?
Okay. So for a disease like tuberculosis, why would you need to add the latent period into your model structure?
Because in latent period, the population, they don't feel sick. They don't have those symptoms of TB or tuberculosis. They are infected, but they don't have the TB disease.
Okay. Yes. So that's it. So remember, for tuberculosis, when you get infected with tuberculosis, you can either have latent TB where you are infected with tuberculosis. You don't know it because you're not showing symptoms, and they can only find out you have TB through a tuberculin skin test. And then there is the active form of tuberculosis where you are showing symptoms and you are transmitting it to others. And ideally, from the literature, individuals can spend about 2 years or more being in the latent period, and about 5 to 10% of those in the latent period would go on to develop the active TB. So there's actually like interventions targeted at individuals with latent TB. So like being treated with when you have latent TB so that you don't develop active TB in the next couple of years to contribute to the burden of tuberculosis in the country. So with TB, the role of the latent period in the dynamics of transmission, it's very much established. So if you are modeling TB and you do not include the latent period in your model, like people will begin to question it, and you will need to justify why you excluded it. Okay, so back to this diagram, which explains the infectious disease dynamics. So remember, you get exposed to a disease. With time, your viral load is so high that you begin to transmit to other people, then probably declines with treatment, then you gain immunity from the disease. So this was the SIR model that we looked at. But then in practice, we would have the latent period. Like I mentioned, that's the time between when you are infected and when you get infectious. And then the incubation period, the time between when you got infected and when you start showing symptoms for it. So you have the latent period in this first box where your viral load is not yet high enough for you to start transmitting the disease to others. Okay, so I'm giving an example for chickenpox to really explain why it's good that we understand the latent period of a disease and how that contributes to the dynamics of chickenpox, for example. So at the top here, we have the dynamics of infectiousness. Yes, so you get exposed to the disease, and then there is the latent period. Then from the latent period, you move to the infectious period when you are transmitting the disease. Then you later recover or die from the disease. And then we have the dynamics of the disease. Then that will look at the incubation period, which is the time before symptom onset and when you start showing symptoms for the disease, but you are no longer diseased. So looking at chickenpox, why would the latent period matter for the transmission dynamics of chickenpox? Munga or Steven? Steven Mungao? Okay, Gabriel Montero, I don't think you've spoken yet. Anyone? Okay, so for the sake of time, we know for chickenpox, we have individuals.
Robert Ofwete had put up his hand.
Who?
Robert Ofwete.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Robert, I missed that. Robert, can you
Yes,
please?
okay, Sylvia. I want to give it a try.
Okay.
I think not considering or rather taking account of those in the latent period might affect the overall prediction, rather estimation of the model, because then we are considering them as the infectious. And so we are, it's like we are increasing the number of infectious because we have people who are in infectious and yet they're not supposed to be there because they are not yet infectious. They haven't seroconverged. Yeah.
Yes, that's true. Thank you, Robert. So for the example of chickenpox, remember that people actually start transmitting the chickenpox to other people even before they start showing symptoms. So this is showing that people can actually start being infectious before the symptomatic period, and understanding that would really influence program decisions and interventions that are implemented for a disease. And an example can also be STIs, right? Like HIV, people can start, they'll have like a long latent period. Maybe they're not showing symptoms yet, they have it, and they're able to transmit it to other people. So understanding how the latent period, the incubation period, and the symptomatic period come into play in the epidemiology of a disease is very important. Okay, so now how would we add or account for a latent period in the basic SIR model? So looking at our SIR model, if we want to include a latent period, where would that go in our model diagram? Am I missing any hand up?
I can try, Sylvia.
Okay, John.
Yes, I would say we can trick the model a bit so that we have an additional compartment. Let's say because they have the virus or the parasite, you can say they are exposed to the parasite. Then as the viral load of the parasitemia goes up, they transition from now being exposed to now being infectious. So maybe I might be wrong, but between susceptible and infectious, we can have a different compartment of exposed individuals.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's where the states will come in. So we have the L compartment. You know, there are people, mostly you would see exposed instead of a latent compartment being used, and it really depends on who is teaching it or who is explaining it. Okay, so recall the equations we had for the SIR model. So how would we modify this set of equations to incorporate the latent period into it? So here, let's assume that alpha is the rate at which individuals move from L to I. What would change in our equations? Noah?
Yes, Dr. Sylvia.
Yes. So how, if we want to add the dynamics in the latent period into our equations, how would we incorporate that? Proscovia, I see your hand up.
Yes, so I think we shall introduce a new differential equation, dl dt, and then our ds dt will become negative bs over n, and then our dl dt will become bs over n minus alpha I, and then our di dt will become alpha I minus gamma r, and then our dr dt will become gamma r.
Okay. So I'm going to give, thank you so much, Proscovia. It gets really tricky how to write out these equations, but this is the trick I learned. So the parameter value, right, you would usually multiply that by the preceding compartment. Okay, so for example, for alpha, so we are looking at people moving from L to I, right? So you would multiply the alpha by L instead of I. Does that make sense, Proscovia?
Yes, doctor, it makes sense.
Doctor,
Yes,
I beg your pardon on that.
Sorry?
I beg your pardon on that.
So I'm saying that writing out the equations can be quite tricky. But then the simplest way I found in understanding this is that you are looking at how people move from one compartment to the other, right? So for example, for the L, we are looking at how people will move from L to I. So the simplest way I found is that these parameter values, you would multiply them by the preceding compartment. That is where people are moving from, not where they are moving to. So for Proscovia, she multiplied the parameters by the compartment individuals are moving to. But that's not it. So the easiest way, if you find every model, if you are given any model structure and you have to write out the equations, you just have to remember that you are interested where people are moving from. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
okay.
That is true.
Great. So this is what changes in equations. So we introduced the DLDT, and now we have the newly exposed individuals moving to the L compartment, and those who leave the L compartment will now enter the infectious compartment. Okay, so another example here, like we had before, it's
I'm sorry to take you back a bit, the previous slide.
Okay.
I thought our ds dt will become negative beta SL over N.
So this is the force of,
Negative beta S.
sorry?
Okay, now continue, doctor.
Okay, so remember the force of infection we talked about in the, thank you, that was a great question. Remember the force of infection we talked about in the previous lecture, which is the rate at which new diseases are introduced, happen in the population, that it's equal to the transmission rate times the prevalence of the disease in the population. And remember, we also said that the prevalence of the disease, which is the number of people with the disease at any given time, is actually your I compartment. So that is why we multiply by the I instead of the L. But this is really dependent on the assumptions that you would you usually make about the disease, especially if you are looking at the SEIR model. Does that make sense, Proscovia? Sorry?
And which particular assumption did we make here to conclude that the SDT will be negative beta SI over N?
So this is, so remember, how do I put this? You remember the force of infection?
Yes, I remember.
And that was the product between the transmission rates and the prevalence of the disease in the population.
Yes.
Right. And you know what the prevalence is, so the number of people with the disease, so you can understand that as maybe those who have tested positive for COVID or who are showing symptoms of COVID. And remember that if you are in the latent period, you do not have the disease yet. Remember that, right? So then you can't count people in the latent period as having the disease, then therefore using that to account for the prevalence of a disease.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I get you now.
Yes. So
yes, it does.
The rates at which individuals would leave the susceptible, it's always the product of the force of infection times the transmission coefficient, which will give you the force of infection. Okay. Robert, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Sylvia. I just wanted to add on to whatever you're saying, maybe just to clarify the point, if you allow me to, is that we are looking at rate in the change of susceptible over time. And maybe the easiest way to look at it is that a susceptible individual can only move from that compartment if they are infected, right? But then the person who has to infect them should be infectious. And the latent person hasn't become infectious yet. So he or she has to meet with an infected person who is infectious. And so that defines whatever two compartments that you will actually multiply in an equation. This beta SI is a product of susceptible person getting into contact with an infectious person before they move. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And I hope that better clarifies it for you too, Proscovia. Yeah. So the last question I have on this presentation as a recap is, when might it be necessary to include a separate compartment for individuals in the latent stage? Stephen Mungal.
Sylvia, can I give it a try?
Yes, Brian.
I think it would depend on the disease. because we saw why TB had a latent period and chickenpox, so I think to include a separate compartment would depend on the disease. If, for example, it was chickenpox, we realized that some people, the person who is infected actually infects other people before the signs can come out. And for TB, someone who has developed latent TB can be infecting other people before latent TB develops into active TB. So I think when might we be able to include a separate compartment will depend on the disease.
Okay, great. Yes. So it really depends on the disease, and some people like you that it depends on how long individuals will stay in the latent period. So for example, we know that when you are exposed to COVID, depending on your immune status and level of transmissibility of the person you came into contact with, it might take, or even the example of cholera, it might take just like a couple of hours to a few days for you to start being infectious of the disease. And for COVID-19, there are some researchers who think that the time individuals spend in the latent period is so low that you do not even have to include it in the dynamics of in your model diagram. So yeah, it depends on the disease and the assumption you are making about how long individuals will stay in the latent period. Okay, any questions?
So maybe to add on that, if you want to clarify at the start was, whatever modeling you're doing, you have to be aware of the epidemiology of the disease and how.
Sorry, can you please repeat that?
You told us something about being aware of the epidemiology of the disease which you're trying to model. So you have to know the epidemiology and its progression and transmission. That's very key as a person who's doing modeling.
Yes, that's like the number one rule of modeling. Otherwise, you might disgrace yourself. So, for example, Abel's last question in the last section about trying to use an SIR model to explain the dynamics of a disease to someone who is so much experienced in the epidemiology. And let's say you are so sure that the SIR model, it's enough for it, then the person starts bombarding you. Oh, what about the asymptomatic compartment? What about the latent compartment? And you have no idea of that. That can be very embarrassing. So it's best you understand the transmission dynamics and the natural history of the disease that you are working on. And ideally, we really don't work in isolation. So if your background is not in epi or you don't understand the natural history of the disease, you could always collaborate with an epidemiologist to work on your project. So when you understand the quantitative aspect of what you are working on, that the person will also bring in their knowledge on the transmission dynamics of the disease. Great. Any other question?
Yes, I have one.
Okay.
This is Abel. At what stage would you comment about the inclusion of the social sciences aspects or the economic aspects of whatever you could be working on?
So I would say that throughout the process of whatever project you are working on, so you work in a team. So if you are interested in questions related to, let's say, the cost effectiveness of an intervention, then probably at the beginning when you are forming your team, you have the modelers, you have the epidemiologists, then you probably need like a health economist, unless maybe the modeler has an experience in economic evaluation methods, or you are willing to self-learn, because working together from the beginning really would inform the type of question you want to answer, and that would also inform the your model structure, the interventions you want to assess, because it's best to imagine you don't include, you're looking at cost effectiveness of interventions and you don't consult with with a health economist. And then when you are done with modeling, you have your output and everything, you present with the health economics and they are like, okay, this doesn't make sense. You could have done this, you could have done that. So I think it's really best to work as a team throughout the process of the project, depending on the question you are interested in. And same goes for the social scientists. Thank you, Abel. John.
When might it be necessary to include a separate compartment? And I think I've even gotten an answer to my previous question, because if you take the case of malaria, you'll have a lot of people who are asymptomatic, especially from malaria endemic regions, but they may never really fully transition to the infectious category or presenting clinical symptoms, but they have the parasite in their system. So to have a comprehensive understanding of the disease epidemiology, for this case, malaria, it's important to have that additional compartment. And I think once you also understand that, you'll be able to inform more, especially with interventions to be put in place so as to reduce maybe the transition rate to the infectious bit, which would be very critical to managing the disease. So thank you so much.
Okay, great. Remember I said you have an answer to your question, and I'm glad you do now. Okay, is there any other question on this? Great, then Abel, can I move to the last one then?
Yes, let me stop the recording now.